Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to really unpack some critical global developments.
Yeah, cutting through the noise, that's the aim.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Today, we are plunging into some really intricate, sometimes bewildering dynamics in international relations.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking closely at the big players, the U.S., Russia, Europe.
And how they all connect?
Precisely. We'll examine U.S. President Trump's posture towards Russian President Putin and this whole situation with aid to Ukraine. Is it flowing? Is it not?
It's been very back and forth, hasn't it?
It really has. And then there's this, deeply unsettling re-emergence of chemical weapons allegations.
Yeah, that's a worrying development. Definitely demands attention.
Absolutely. And finally, we'll shift over to Europe, specifically Germany, seeing some significant policy changes there.
Mm.
And you can feel a shift in public sentiment about the conflict.
Big shifts. It's not just policy. It's the mood on the street, too.
So our deep dive today is really about distilling the key insights, understanding the bigger picture from all these interactions. Let's unpack this.
It's definitely a layered situation, and the insights we've pulled together, they offer a fascinating look behind the curtain, really highlighting how interconnected these global threads are.
It's a lot to synthesize.
Oh, immense. But hopefully we can bring some clarity.
Okay, let's start with something that feels like it's constantly in the news, the shifting sands of U.S. foreign policy, especially regarding Ukraine aid.
Right. We've
noticed, and it's been observed, this pattern with U.S. President Trump's statements about Russian President Putin.
Yeah. What kind of pattern?
It often seems like his remarks are deflecting or maybe projecting his own actions onto the Russian leader.
Ah, I see. Like accusing Putin of inconsistency when maybe.
Exactly. When maybe U.S. President Trump himself is perceived as inconsistent. He might imply Russian President Putin is spewing out BS. But the interesting thing is, Russian President Putin's stance, it's been remarkably consistent since this all began.
That is a critical point, because if you look at the broader strategy, Russia has, from the start, sought a political settlement, a definitive resolution on those key territories.
Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk.
Kherson, Zaporizhia.
All right.
From their perspective, those regions are, quote, gone and never coming back. That position hasn't really wavered.
Which creates this stark contrast, doesn't it? A consistent Russian stance versus what's seen as U.S. inconsistency, especially since the U.S. President Trump administration.
It does, and it suggests, maybe a fundamental difference in what each side expects or is aiming for.
And it points to this apparent unwillingness, maybe, from the U.S. side to accept the facts on the ground.
A reluctance to tell Kyiv, perhaps, that these regions just aren't coming back to Ukrainian control.
Yeah, and what's really striking, almost paradoxical, is how U.S. President Trump's actions, or maybe inactions, might be seen as indirectly giving Russia a kind of green light. Well, particularly after Ukraine started carrying out these more daring attacks inside Russia itself, targeting nuclear deterrent sites, infrastructure in places like Kursk.
Okay, yeah. From Russia's perspective, that would demand a strong response.
Right. And if the U.S. posture is seen as unclear or less than fully committed, then U.S. President Trump's moves, perhaps unintentionally, could be interpreted by Moscow as enabling their continued push for their security objectives.
So every action, or even a lack of action, carries huge weight in this complex dynamic.
Absolutely.
And it's fascinating how this bigger policy picture plays out in specific decisions, like the aid situation. We looked into that incident, the CNN reporter asking U.S. President Trump about the Pentagon pausing weapons shipments.
Oh, right. That was a tense moment.
Yeah.
Ukraine urgently needing aid, and suddenly a pause.
Exactly. It potentially offered a glimpse into the inner workings, or maybe the lack of clear workings, on critical decisions.
And the response itself was described as, quite bizarre.
What did he say again?
When asked if he approved the pause, his reply was apparently, "I don't know, what did you tell me?" And then he deflected, told the reporter to ask Secretary Hagstead.
Wow. So just punted it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the analysis we saw pointed out, look, either way it doesn't look good, right? Either Hagstead acted alone, which raises questions, or U.S. President Trump ordered it and then reversed it, which also raises questions.
Neither scenario suggests a clear, coherent process. It certainly didn't clarify who was calling the shots or why.
Left a lot of people wondering about the consistency of U.S. policy at a critical time.
Yeah, it raises big questions about transparency, accountability, especially with military aid in wartime. At the same time, you have U.S. President Trump's narrative about Russian President Putin killing too many people. But the way it's framed seems to characterize casualties broadly, like the general population, rather than differentiating combatants.
Whereas Russia tends to be more specific.
We find Russia is generally quite meticulous in their reporting about distinguishing civilian casualties from military ones. That difference in framing, it really shapes public perception, doesn't it? Influences who's seen as the aggressor, who's the victim.
Language matters hugely in conflict.
It's never accidental. It has real persuasive power.
So after that strange pause, U.S. President Trump did decide to unpause the aid.
Right, the flow restarted.
But, and this is the detail that really jumps out, the initial package reportedly included only 10 interceptors.
10? Just 10.
Just 10. And an interceptor, for clarity, that's a missile designed to shoot down incoming threats, missiles, drones, planes. It's frontline air defense.
Okay, so 10 of those against what Russia's throwing at Ukraine.
Exactly, against Russian airstrikes happening almost nightly, hitting cities, infrastructure across the country. 10 is, well, it's starkly, incredibly insufficient.
It sounds like almost nothing.
We saw assessments saying even 100 interceptors wouldn't be nearly enough, maybe giving Kyiv like 15 minutes worth of air cover.
15 minutes for a whole city.
For a relatively small area like Kyiv, yeah. It really puts the scale of Ukraine's needs and the actual impact of this resumed aid into perspective. It's sobering.
So the aid is back on, but it doesn't fundamentally change the tactical reality on the ground.
Doesn't seem like it based on that initial number.
And connecting this back, that profound inadequacy, it points to maybe a larger issue, doesn't it? These shifting U.S. military priorities you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Which leads us directly to another really disturbing development, these allusions to chemical weapons.
Ah, yes. CIA Director John Ratcliffe.
Right. He alluded to Russia using them. This is described as pulling the, quote, last card of desperation, maybe, trying to win the public narrative, frame it as a just war.
It's such a grave accusation. Chemical weapons. It carries immense moral, legal weight, often used when the pressure is really on, politically or militarily.
Definitely echoes some chilling historical moments. You immediately think of 2003, the lead up to Iraq, the WMD claims.
Or Syria. How many times were those allegations used against the Syrian government? Often to justify specific actions.
It feels like a familiar and frankly unsettling playbook. Makes you question the timing, the motivation behind such serious claims right now.
Absolutely. The gravity can't be overstated, and the timing is always suspect.
Yeah.
However, alongside those claims from the U.S. side, we also identified counterclaims, suggestions that there's very well documented evidence, at least from the Russian perspective, of Ukraine using or trying to use chemical weapons.
So conflicting narratives again.
Yeah.
Making it incredibly hard to know the truth.
Very difficult. And remember that press conference where Ratcliffe made the allusion? There was an interesting exchange.
What happened?
Well, U.S. President Trump engaged Ratcliffe on it, but then he was observed quietly asking Secretary Hegstead, do you know anything about this?
Really? Asking his Secretary of Defense on the spot like that?
Apparently so. The analysis we saw described it as clear passing the buck, suggesting this kind of on-the-fly decision-making, almost like The Apprentice style, happening right there in a full cabinet setting.
Wow. Decisions, or at least discussions, about something this serious happening seemingly improvised.
That was the observation.
And the implications are huge. I mean, if we're talking illegal actions, chemical weapons use is absolutely illegal. It violates international law, treaties.
No question. It's against all laws of armed conflict.
And the immediate reaction noted in the analysis was, well, if we're going to hold everyone to the standard of no international law violations,
Then what?
then, quote, a lot of things in Israel are just about to come to a halt.
Ah, drawing a parallel.
A profound one. Linking the condemnation of potential chemical weapon use here to other actions in other conflicts that might also be seen as violations. It forces a broader look at consistency in applying international law.
Challenges that selective application we sometimes see. Very interesting point. And this actually brings us quite neatly to that significant shift we detected in U.S. military priorities and the global impact.
Right, the depletion of aid stocks.
Exactly. Our assessment is that U.S. aid stocks have been significantly drawn down. And the main reason cited is prioritizing resources for Israel.
because of the recent conflict there.
It's attributed to what was described as an unprovoked war of aggression by Israel against Iran, an event said to have lasted 12 days, but it kicked off a chain reaction leading to this stock reduction.
So one conflict directly impacting resources available for another. That's a critical link.
It is. So when we discuss aid for Ukraine, it has to be seen in this wider context of U.S. resource allocation.
And it's not just general aid. You mentioned the Iron Dome earlier.
Right. We gathered specifics on that. It's described not as one single system, but an array of advanced anti-aircraft, anti-missile batteries.
And fundamentally U.S. tech.
Primarily U.S. systems, supplied by the U.S., technically supported by the U.S., even U.S. personnel on the ground for maintenance, for training. It's essentially a U.S. system operationally.
And the priority is clear.
Crystal clear, according to our findings, Israel is #1 priority. Ukraine is described as a distant second, especially if Israel is seen as being under threat.
That fundamentally changes the calculation for everyone involved, especially Ukraine.
And for Russia, too. We believe Russian President Putin senses this shift in U.S. priorities.
Makes sense.
So Russia putting sustained pressure on Ukraine right now, from a purely military standpoint, it's seen as a smart thing to do.
They're exploiting an opening.
It looks like they're strategically taking advantage of the U.S. being overextended, committed heavily elsewhere, particularly the Middle East.
That insight really helps understand the current tempo of operations in Ukraine, why Russia might feel this is the moment to push.
It suggests a calculated move, capitalizing on what they perceive as U.S. resource strain.
Okay, let's shift focus now over to Europe. We're seeing some big moves there too, particularly Germany.
Yeah, Germany's role seems to be evolving quite rapidly.
They've been suggesting other nations provide more Patriot missile systems to Ukraine.
Highly effective systems.
And Germany itself is willing to contribute more. The new chancellor, Merz, he seems quite intent on matching or maybe even exceeding what France and Britain are doing militarily.
Like he wants Germany to sort of bow up, assert itself more forcefully.
That's the feeling. A real departure from their more restrained post-war defense policy.
But that increased military posture, all that spending, it's not universally popular at home, is it?
Not at all. We've seen significant domestic opposition. A German parliamentarian from the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD.
The right-wing populist party.
Right. Directly challenged Merz on it. The critique is sharp, and it's about the money. Germany's racking up huge debt, like $42.3 billion, mainly for weapons for Ukraine.
While domestic promises aren't being met.
Exactly. Promised tax cuts for German citizens. Not happening. So people are seeing their tax money go abroad, while things at home might be getting tighter.
That creates resentment, surely.
It's being framed very forcefully as an absolute impertinence towards the working middle classes. A fatal signal, they called it, that the leadership doesn't grasp the seriousness of the economic situation in Germany.
So the cost of this foreign policy is becoming very real, very tangible for ordinary Germans.
Absolutely.
And this touches on that unique fiscal situation in the EU, right? It's different from how the U.S. handles debt.
Very different. Brussels has to approve national budgets initially. Member states have to maintain a certain fiscal discipline for the stability of the whole EU, the European Central Bank.
So you can't just raise the debt ceiling easily like in the U.S.
Not usually.
Yeah.
It often means constitutional changes or altering these deeply set, immovable policies. And many European countries already have high debt-to-GDP ratios. Their debt is already significant compared to their economy.
Which means financing this big rearming of Europe push, it's going to require cuts elsewhere.
Likely severe austerity measures. We're talking potential IMF-style cuts, social programs, entitlements, public services, pensions, things that hit people directly.
Ouch. That's a hard sell politically.
Extremely hard. So while Chancellor Merz might have ridden in partly on this agenda of strengthening Europe's defense, making the transition away from relying so heavily on the U.S. for NATO's muscle, it's going to be very hard and painful to sell that to the public when the bill comes due.
The fiscal reality bites.
It's starting to.
And adding to that economic strain, Germany's still dealing with paying, over the odds for U.S. imported LNG.
Because Nord Stream is gone.
Yeah.
And they can't easily buy Russian gas due to sanctions.
Right. More expensive energy. And that leads to concerns about German industry maybe moving elsewhere, offshoring.
And a brain drain.
Yeah. Reports of upper management, engineers leaving because of these economic pressures. It just compounds the problem.
It's this complex cascade, isn't it? Economic decisions, geopolitical events, all tangled together.
Definitely. And what was once quite popular, broad German support for Ukraine, it's now hitting that financial crunch. The costs are becoming unavoidable.
To the point where questions are being asked in the German parliament, even about the legality of the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran.
Yes, indicating this growing, maybe still minority, but growing opposition to certain foreign policy alignments. Even with a generally pro-U.S. press, the public pressure from the economic squeeze makes managing the narrative really tough for the government.
And parties like the AfD gain traction.
It seems to be a direct consequence. And we've also seen observations that the initial wave of Ukrainian refugee virtue signaling, as one source bluntly put it,
that enthusiasm has waned.
It's past its date in places like Poland and Germany. Public support is strained, largely because of these domestic economic realities.
So economic pressures are driving major political shifts.
Profound ones.
Which brings us, I guess, to the fundamental question. What's the end state here?
Yeah.
Where is this all heading?
That's the critical focus now. And there seems to be a consensus on one thing. The longer this goes on, the more unpopular it gets, especially if the feeling grows that Ukraine cannot win a decisive military victory.
That perception of stalemate or even eventual loss really changes the political math.
Hugely. But then you have this psychological block, especially in Europe. Russia can't be seen to win.
So Ukraine can't win, Russia can't be seen to win. It's an intractable paradox almost.
It feels like it. And the goal of the, let's call them Eurohawks, and the new NATO chief, Mark Rutte, seems to be leaning towards selling a war, advocating for this bigger military buildup in Europe.
Which clashes directly with those domestic pressures we just talked about.
Exactly. That's the core dilemma. Leaders might show solidarity on the world stage. Macron, U.S. President Trump, Merz, Starmer, looks good internationally.
But back home?
Back home, it's a different conversation altogether. They have to deal with their own politics, budgets, citizens feeling the pinch from these policies. The gap between the international show and the domestic reality is widening.
So the huge unanswered question really is there a way out? Can the U.S. maybe broker some kind of solution where, quote, Russia didn't win, but Ukraine didn't lose?
Some kind of negotiated middle ground.
Yeah, something complex, maybe messy, but something Europe might accept just to get stability back.
But then you have the question of whether the current Ukrainian government would ever accept such a deal, especially if it means losing territory or making concessions they see as unacceptable.
Right, which leaves what the alternative seems to be just more of the same.
Which is seen as leading only to a worsening situation. More economic pain for Europe, more devastation for Ukraine, continued instability.
How long can that dynamic hold?
That's the question. It feels unsustainable. It truly is an intricate web, international relations, economic pressures, domestic politics, all pulling in different directions.
Indeed. We've explored how these powerful forces are really shaping global affairs right now, in real time. The profound question left hanging, I think, is how long can these current dynamics possibly persist before some kind of fundamental shift in strategy becomes, well, not just desirable, but inevitable? And what shape might that shift ultimately take? Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.